Well, good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are in the country. We're going to give folks just another minute or so to hop on, and then we're going to go ahead and get started.
Hey, Amanda.
Hi, good afternoon.
Nice to see you.
While we're waiting, just a reminder that everybody should have gotten an email from me yesterday with a copy of the frequently asked questions for this project and a copy of the state application materials. If you did not receive that email, please feel free to send a chat message to me now, and we'll make sure that that gets forwarded to you so you have that to refer to as we're talking today. Just give folks another minute and then we'll get started. Cameras today are entirely optional. You should feel free to have yours on or off as you prefer. And again,
hey,
a reminder. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to tell you that I'm going to be eating my lunch, so my video is going to be off.
It is lunchtime on the East Coast, so, and maybe even lunchtime in the Central. So we'll be delighted to have any of you in whatever version of your present able to share. All right, so again, if you did not receive an email from us yesterday, the FAQ for this project, the application for this project, just send me a chat message now and we'll make sure that you get that, and we'll get started in just a minute. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. I know all of you have an enormous amount on your plates, so we appreciate that you made time to hop on with us today. Or if you are watching this in the future as a recorded session, we welcome you too. I know there were some folks who could not make the live session and will be watching this recording later. I'm Amanda Berkson-Chilcock. I'm a senior fellow here at National Skills Coalition. And I'm going to be sort of your guide, walking you through the agenda today. We have some other folks who will be weighing in at various parts, and we'll have time throughout the agenda for you all to weigh in with your own reflections and questions. We'll also be available following today's event for additional follow-up questions that you may have in the coming weeks. So you're all here today because you work for state government in some capacity, or for a quasi-governmental agency in a couple of cases, perhaps in the labor agency or in the education department, higher education coordinating board, perhaps in the governor's office, serving as an advisor on the future of work or digital skills or racial equity. But really because your work touches in some way, shape, or form on upskilling and potentially on upskilling for essential workers that helps close racial equity gaps and reach small businesses in essential industries. So the purpose of today's session is to really give you as much information as we can arm you with about what our technical assistance project is and why your state might want to participate. So my goal, by the time you walk away from today's session, is you're going to have a really clear understanding of what's the project, why might we want to participate, if we do want to apply to participate, what's the process for doing that, and where can I go if I have more questions? So that's what I most want you to be walking away with at the end of today's session. But we're going to give you a little background about National Skills Coalition. Some of you know us well, some of you may be very new to National Skills Coalition, and a little bit of background about why we've chosen this focus for the Technical Assistance Project and how that has really been developed in response to feedback we've gotten from you and your peers in state agencies around the country over the last 18 months, as all of us have been sort of riding this wild roller coaster that has been the COVID pandemic and the pandemic economy. Today, we're going to talk through the project itself. We're going to talk through why your state might want to apply to participate, questions you may have, and then again, the process and next steps. So you've met me. I've been with National Skills Coalition a little over 6 years. I'm a senior fellow, which means that I focus on a couple of subject areas in particular. In my case, that's adult education, digital literacy, and immigrant integration. NSC as an organization is a workforce development policy advocacy organization. We recognize that jobs that require skills training past high school, but not a 4-year degree, are really the backbone of our economy. And so we as an advocacy organization are a big tent bipartisan coalition, workforce boards, community colleges, nonprofit community-based organizations, labor unions, labor management partnerships, chambers of commerce, industry associations, really anyone with a shared interest in making sure that workers have access to high quality workforce development so they can upskill and get good jobs, and businesses have access to the talent they need to be able to see sustained growth in their communities. So that's us as an organization. We do our work through organizing in networks. So we're kind of unlike the traditional Washington think tank in that our strength really comes from our members in the field who help us develop and test policies, kick the tires, and sort of vet policy ideas and interventions, and then really lift up the policies that have the most robust results to be able to institutionalize those at the state and federal level. We have our national network, which many of you know. We have 20 state level coalitions known as SkillSpan. We have our Business Leaders Coalition, known as BLUE, or Business Leaders United. And then we have our grassroots worker level advocates, and that activity is called Voices for Skills. And I've linked to each of those networks on the slide here. So if you are newer to National Skills Coalition and you are wanting to dig deeper and learn more about us, you can do that following today's session. Okay, so let's talk for just a moment here about the context for this technical assistance project. We all know that the pandemic has reshaped our economy and the workforce in numerous ways, but I want to emphasize a couple. The first is really this absolute awareness. A lot of policymakers have had an aha moment that everyone needs digital skills, and that without broadband access and devices, yes, but more importantly, digital skills to be able to use those devices and that access, people are going to get left out. They're going to get furloughed from jobs and not be able to be called back because they haven't done their COVID safety training online. They're going to have their jobs change under their feet to suddenly require many more digital skills. I've heard stories about everything from port workers handling logistics and distribution to healthcare workers who were medical office front-end receptionists and then had to turn overnight into telehealth coordinators, standing outside in a parking lot, holding an iPad, trying to help patients log into telehealth. So people's jobs have changed rapidly to demand more digital skills. And we've seen many businesses, including many smaller businesses that didn't have a huge budget for technological advancement, really accelerate the pace of change incredibly quickly. Again, another story I got from the Port of Long Beach out in California was around small third-party logistics companies that had been handling a lot of things on paper pre-pandemic and very rapidly had to shift to digital overnight when the pandemic hit. and they had a lot of frontline workers in that relatively small company that had to change overnight as well. So we've seen things changing really fast for essential workers. And we know that even before the pandemic, there were numerous ways in which structural racism was compounding inequities for those workers, right? People were less likely to be employed in many cases, payroll jobs, right? They might be 1099 independent contractors. And thus their employers might have been less likely to invest in their skills, or they might not have been eligible for tuition assistance that their companies offered. And we know that workers of color are more likely to be in some of those precarious frontline jobs. And some of that really almost episodic employment, even if they're staying in the same industry or the same occupation. We know that structural racism means that workers of color have less access to home broadband internet and often less access to devices, not just because of the racial wealth gap, but because of housing segregation and related challenges around that. Without digital devices and broadband, it's harder to develop digital skills. It's harder to participate in online learning. So we know that these things were all challenges pre-pandemic, and we know the pandemic has really just magnified those challenges. You all know just as well, if not better than I do, the challenges around childcare, the challenges around essential workers themselves who don't have paid sick leave. And we know that those are disproportionately falling harder on people who were in low-wage jobs before the pandemic, disproportionately people of color, disproportionately English learners, all of the ways in which workers can be marginalized in the workforce. And then we know that there are particular challenges for small and mid-sized businesses, some of which are owned by entrepreneurs of color. We know that small and mid-sized businesses have been trying really hard to keep their head above water and make sure that their businesses survive the pandemic. And that has really limited their ability to do workforce training or to invest in upskilling of their workforce at a time when they're really just trying to keep their heads above water. And we also know that, again, even pre-pandemic, small and mid-sized businesses sometimes struggled to access public policies that would help them upskill their workers. Maybe those policies were tax credits and the small business didn't have a lot of tax liability. Or maybe those policies were reimbursement policies and the small business didn't have a lot of cash to outlay to train workers to wait for reimbursement to come from the state months or even a year later. So we know that there are a lot of ways in which small and mid-sized businesses, in particular those in essential industries, have themselves also faced challenges. So that's kind of the big picture context, right? There are all these changes happening in the economy. Those changes are disproportionately affecting some workers and some businesses. I'd love to now just take a moment for reflection from all of you. If you're seeing things like this in your state, please just drop a message into the chat and share what does or does not reflect your experience of the quick sort of Cook's tour that I just ran us through. We'll just take a minute or so for folks to add in comments. And again, I know some of you are in jobs where you're directly dealing with worker training and small business contacts. Some of you may be a little farther removed from that, but my guess is that all of you are seeing data coming from your state labor market information agencies, proposals coming from your governor's office, initiatives that you all are working on. So interested in seeing the ways in which this does or does not affect or reflect rather what your state has seen. So as folks are thinking about that, I'm going to move on to talk a little bit more about some specific ways that states have tackled the challenge of supporting workers in upskilling. So some of you probably saw this last summer, but some of you may not. I am seeing that at least in one state, folks are looking to increase access for small businesses and increase efficiency in serving small business workforce development. So that's a good example, right? That's a solution that a state is looking towards. And I'd be curious to know whether that solution is being developed because they've gotten feedback from small businesses about the ways in which the system does or does not work well for businesses right now. So the report we put out last summer was focused in particular on the 30 states that have incumbent worker training funds. And some of you may have seen this report at the time. My colleague Haley is going to drop the link to the report in the chat so that you all can refer to it if you are interested in digging deeper. I've also put the link at the bottom of the slide here. So what we did with this report was we did kind of a landscape scan. How many states even have incumbent worker training funds that are separate from the federal WIOA money? What do those funds look like? And how successful are those funds at reaching frontline workers, particularly those with foundational skills gaps and small and mid-sized businesses? Now, this was basically a pre-pandemic report in that the information for it was gathered in 2019 and early 2020. We published in the summer of 2020, and we really emphasized a few major findings in the report. The first was we had overwhelming feedback from conversations that oftentimes states' incumbent worker training is buried several layers deep within state government, and state officials aren't confident that businesses know how to find them or why they might want to draw on these funds. And businesses are really not confident that they know where these supports are located and how they might want to access them. So we had some recommendations about what states can do to improve visibility and accessibility of those funds to small businesses. We also got some feedback that only a minority of states were intentionally inclusive of digital skills as something they would include in industry or occupation specific training. And on the one hand, that's not so surprising, right? There's traditionally been an understanding that, oh, digital skills are sort of baseline skills, but now we realize that digital skills are increasingly also occupation or industry specific, right? And so, yeah, you want people to know how to use a mouse and how to log into their email, but you want them to also be comfortable with more sophisticated tasks that look different depending on whether you're a frontline health worker that has to be able to enter patient data using a special app on an iPad, or a transportation and logistics worker that needs to be able to use an inventory app, or so on and so forth. So we saw that only about a third of states were explicit about incorporating digital skills into their upskilling policies, which is not to say that the other states would have forbidden it, but they weren't explicitly allowing it. And so that meant that a lot of businesses assumed that it wasn't eligible. So that was another major finding from our report. We also saw that a lot of states had not particularly looked closely at the demographics of who was participating in these upskilling programs, and were those upskilling programs reaching the workers who could perhaps most effectively benefit from upskilling. And part of that is just resources, right? People don't have that much time to go digging around and analyzing data, or data might not be submitted in a format where it's easy to analyze. But that's another area where there's room for improvement. And we have a host of other things that we found, and I don't want to dwell too much on this because state incumbent worker training funds are really just one lever for upskilling workers. They might not be the appropriate lever in your state. It might be a non-starter in your state. So I don't want to just focus on that. Obviously, states are also investing in programs around post-secondary credential attainment. We'll hear more about that in a minute. And folks, as states are investing in initiatives that target geographic regions, rural parts of the state, or particular industries like manufacturing or healthcare, initiatives that are focused in particular around dealing with the impact of technology and automation, otherwise known as kind of the robots are stealing our jobs, which is, you know, a big topic of conversation in our field. So there's a range of ways that employers and workers engage with state government around upskilling. And I want to highlight a couple of those ways in particular. So we have some guest presenters that are joining us today. Before we get to that, I do see there have been a couple more comments in the chat and I'd like to lift those up. So I see that Alex is saying that in their state, they're looking at aligning and streamlining state services to businesses so that businesses can more easily choose from a menu of services. And that certainly reflects feedback we've heard in research that National Skills Coalition has done. And it looks like ETP out in California, which is the largest state incumbent worker training fund in the country, has relaxed its funding rules to let apprenticeships use remote learning, right? So that sounds like a very COVID-driven change. And it wouldn't surprise me if there have been similar changes in other states around virtual or online learning. So just moving on, as mentioned, there's a couple of state examples that we wanted to lift up just as ways to kind of illustrate part of the universe of options of how states are thinking about upskilling. So first up is Robert Duncan from the Commonwealth Corporation in Massachusetts. Some of you may know Robert and may know ComCore, as it's often nicknamed. Some of you may even know the Workforce Training Fund. But Robert, first, welcome, and can you unmute yourself if you have not already done that? I'm seeing that Robert has not yet unmuted himself, so I'll give him another minute. And while we're waiting on that, I'm just going to make sure that our second guest speaker, Brandy, Brandy, I see that you're on screen. Can you give me a wave if you can hear me? Okay, great. So we're actually then going to switch gears. We'll start with Brandy and we'll come to Robert in a minute. You know, Brandy is with the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. So first of all, Brandy, welcome. If you can unmute yourself and say hello, that'd be great.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining. And one of the reasons I asked you to join was because Michigan has in the past few months launched a program called Futures for Frontliners. Can you briefly describe what Futures for Frontliner is?
Yeah, absolutely. So Futures for Frontliners is a tuition scholarship for individuals that served on the front lines of the pandemic during our first wave of COVID, approximately through April of 2020 through June of 2020. So that's basically that second quarter of the year 2020. And it provides a tuition-free pathway to a certificate or an associate degree at one of Michigan's 28 community colleges or 3 tribal colleges. So there's 31 eligible institutions. And the eligibility is really totally focused on basically 2 things. One, that you served and worked outside of your home at least part-time during this very scary moment in history when we knew very, very little about the pandemic and how it was transmitted. These are the individuals that really kept us safe and our society functioning while most of us were safe at home, sheltering in place. So they include people like grocery store cashiers and shelf stockers, direct care workers working in nursing homes or in the homes of our elderly Michiganders, janitors and custodians at hospitals, people that worked in mass transit or utilities. And then the second criteria is that you don't already have a college degree. So definitionally, these are individuals that have not yet attained an associate degree and by and large are low wage, low income workers by the nature of that fact. And so we announced that program in April of 2020, that we were going to take steps to develop this scholarship fund for these individuals. We opened up registration in September of 2020 and accepted applications through December 31st of this year.
So that is super exciting. And I want to flag two things that you said that I think are particularly interesting. So the first is you were talking about people who had to work out of their homes. So they were not able to stay at home and work remotely as many of us were. And second of all, you're talking about people who were working in that first wave of the pandemic when, as you said, we knew very little and it was a really scary, tumultuous time. Let me ask, that there's been a lot of attention paid to unemployed workers and states have quite rightly put a ton of attention on that. But you're focusing in part on people who stayed in frontline jobs during at least part of the pandemic. There's been a lot of curiosity about whether those workers even have the bandwidth or interest in participating in upskilling. So what has been the response from workers to the Futures program? Have you received a lot of applications?
The response was overwhelming, and I'll talk about the funding for the program in a second, but we had done some initial cost estimates about how the scholarship would be funded, and very, very quickly those cost estimates were blown out of the water because of the uptake on the award. So we ultimately had 120,000 individuals apply for the scholarship. They had to provide some proof of employment or give us permission to use our own state records to make sure that they were indeed employed in one of these categories of workers during the pandemic. And so after that verification of the 120,000, over 80,000, actually it was closer to 85,000 individuals ultimately qualified. So we have 85,000 individuals who applied for the Futures for Frontliners scholarship and have been awarded. They have, during this calendar year of 2021, to actually take their first semester of classes. So they have to start their college journey. They sort of got qualified in 2020. They have to start their community college journey in 2021. We have almost 18,000 of those individuals who started either in January when, to be honest, we are still obviously very much in the throes of the pandemic. Vaccines were not widely available. They could start in the summer semester, or they could start in the fall. So we've had about 17,000 individuals start the program in one of those first two semesters. But we, after sort of speaking with lots and lots of these frontliners, we know that many of them planned to, or most of them plan to enroll this fall in September. And that we don't have enrollment data yet with the semester just kicking off. But we expect, at least double that 17,000 number to actually take advantage of the scholarship this fall.
That is great. And I think that's really helpful for folks to know, because again, a big unknown for frontline workers is, do they even have the bandwidth to think about upskilling? So it's really interesting that you all had 120,000 initial responses of essential workers who said, yep, I'm raising my hand. I'm interested in this upskilling opportunity. I want to pursue more education. So, states have received various types of COVID relief funds from the federal government. We've seen states obviously got CARES Act money last spring, or spring of 2020 rather. There was American Rescue Plan money. There's been other money. What did Michigan use to initially fund Futures for Frontliners? And what are you thinking now that you've gotten this big response and you have all this enthusiasm, and perhaps more enthusiasm than you had originally allocated funding for?
Yeah, so I think a couple of pieces of context. So the short answer is the initial funding source came from the GEER Fund, which is GEER, which is the Governor's Education Emergency Relief Fund, which was part of the first tranche of CARES Act funding. These were discretionary dollars that governors' offices could utilize to target COVID emergency relief or response as it relates to education. Michigan's total allocation was, I believe, right around 87 million. We used 24 million for this purpose. The vast majority of states use these funds for K-12 related areas, and we certainly did a chunk of it for K-12, but it was allowable to be used either in early childhood education or in post-secondary education. And so we took Governor Whitmer decided to put $24 million dollars on kind of the post-secondary side. One thing I forgot to mention too that I think is important for this population is the program offered two pathways, one for those that had a high school diploma or a GED to pursue post-secondary, and another pathway for those that did not yet possess a high school diploma or a GED, which we called Path 2. So there is also a path to utilize the scholarship for both, to first get your GED and then or high school equivalency, and then to pursue some type of post-secondary credential at one of our eligible institutions. We thought of this, we were motivated for the Futures for Frontliners scholarship really around kind of two reasons. In our minds, it's a twofer. So one is sort of the obvious workforce development, talent investment goals. The governor had set a goal of 60% post-secondary attainment by 2030 early in her administration, which was a year prior in 2019. So the governor was very focused on talent investment and in particular helping Michiganders who live below the ALICE threshold in working poverty to be able to pursue a certificate or an associate degree and earn a post-secondary credential. But then secondarily, for this particular population, it was also a way for us to extend our immense gratitude for these essential workers who, like I said, kept us safe and kept our communities running with essential services, while most of us, and frankly, most of us with bachelor's degrees and beyond, were able to kind of comfortably and safely work remotely without interruptions to our paychecks. And so we likened it to the GI Bill after World War II, saying thank you to our soldiers. And so this was a way to say thank you to those essential workers.
Great. Thanks so much, Brandy. We're going to shift gears now. The Michigan example was one of a new program that got stood up during the pandemic using federal COVID relief funds. We're going to turn now to Massachusetts. Robert Duncan is joining us from Commonwealth Corporation. Hopefully the technical difficulties have been smoothed out here. Thanks, Robert, for hanging in with us through some Zoom craziness there. We're glad that you're able to join us. The Massachusetts Workforce Training Fund has actually been around for a while. In fact, the seeds of it were planted about 20 years ago, if I remember correctly. So it's definitely not a new program, but it continues to be tweaked and reshaped and adjusted to respond to emerging needs. So Robert, can you just start by briefly describing the Workforce Training Fund for folks who might not be familiar with it?
Sure, and thank you. And apologize for my technical deficiencies. The Workforce Training Fund, as you mentioned, is a little over 20 years old, and it's the Massachusetts Incumbent Worker Training Fund. So it's funded by a payroll tax on employers throughout the state who contribute up to $8.40 a year per employee. And those employers are eligible to apply for cash training grants for incumbent worker training. And the Workforce Training Fund is administered by Commonwealth Corporation, or a quasi-public state agency under the Labor and Workforce Development Secretariat. Last year, we awarded about $20 million to train about 13,000 workers. A little under 600 different businesses involved. About 60% of them were 50 employees or fewer, and about 20% had 10 employees or fewer. And we average about $1,600 per participant in incumbent worker investment.
That's great. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And we have two different programs. One is a large 2-year grant of up to $250,000 for extensive customized training programs that are largely geared for larger businesses with more capacity for long-term planning. It's the Express program that is a streamlined, smaller scale, just-in-time program that's geared for small businesses. Small businesses are able to access training from a directory of up to 1,800 different courses and receive a full subsidy for the cost of that training, up to $3,000 per person and up to $30,000 in a year.
That's great. Tell us about the approaches that Commonwealth Corporation is taking to help small businesses access resources to train frontline workers.
Yeah, thanks. As we all know, the pandemic placed undue burden on small businesses, and particularly minority-owned enterprises and women-owned enterprises. We really looked and asked ourselves the critical question of, what does this moment call for? And what it called for is a strategic pivot from serving all businesses to serving small businesses, with a particular emphasis on minority-owned enterprises and women-owned enterprises. The approach we took is using human-centered design approaches to better understand our value proposition that we're offering these small businesses from their perspective, and better understanding of the barriers to participation. We spoke to or engaged with nearly 200 different small businesses. And the feedback that we got, to sum it up real briefly, is that, of course, the finances are a barrier, right? The cost of training. But even more so, they emphasize the challenges of navigating the alphabet soup of resources and programs for small businesses. We had small businesses engaged in a number of different programs with a number of different benefits, and we're finding that they're not crossing silos. They're seeking access to resources only in the programming that they're familiar with. It's really difficult to find the training that they need, even more of a burden than the cost at times. So what they wanted from us is a clear and simple process with good quality user experience, not just good enough for government, but to really live up to consumer expectations in the 21st century. And they needed a greater variety of training options and a larger subsidy. At the time, we were covering half of the cost of training, and we've since shifted to the full subsidy up to $30,000. And the businesses that we were engaged with told us that 91% of them would invest significantly greater within the year under those circumstances. So to sum it up, we did just that. We consolidated programs, we made significant policy changes, we overhauled and streamlined and paid more attention than ever to user experience, and continue to do so, and increase the subsidy to the full cost of training. And we did this launch effective July 1st. So it's very early days, but so far we've had 3 times the the amount of funding awarded to small businesses and 3 times the amount of workers engaged, 2.5 times the number of small businesses that we've had touch points with this year compared to the prior period. And the largest growth has been in the firms with 10 or fewer employees. So we're really seeing some proof of concept that the ease of access can bring in those companies that wouldn't otherwise access these resources. And the training provider community that's also marketing their services have all of a sudden woken up to the opportunity that small businesses bring. And they've so far added 30% more courses to the directory. So we're seeing greater opportunity in terms of variety of offerings as well. So that's been our focus in a nutshell.
That's really helpful. And again, I want to emphasize to folks, the reason we wanted Robert to talk today was because in inviting you to participate in this technical assistance, we know that the ways in which your state trying to support essential work, skilling, and small businesses might look quite different, right? What Robert is not the same as what Andy was describing, and we want to sort of spark your imaginations and encourage you to think about what your state may already be engaged in, where this technical assistance might be able to excel or amplify good work your state is already doing. So thank you, Robert and Brandy, for sharing those more concrete examples with folks. So I want to delve now into what would your state get if you participated in technical assistance project. Now, you've all seen the frequently asked questions, you've all seen the state application materials. You know that this is a 14-month project. After you have about a month to decide if you want to submit an application and to submit an application to us. We are asking that that application be very short and sweet. There's a handful of questions we're asking. We want it to be no more than 4 pages long, and you certainly don't have to hit 4 pages, say it in less. And our goal is really to allow you flexibility to identify the kind of help that would be most useful to your state within the constraints of what we've outlined as the goals and the outcomes for this project. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen for just a minute here to walk you through a couple more specifics about what your state would get from participating in the, and then I'm going to hand it off to our partner in collaborative project, Forbes, at the Center for Regional Economic Competitiveness. So every state, and we're going to be selecting 5 states to project. That selection will happen by mid-November of this year, so a couple weeks after you submit your applications. Every state will receive opportunities to participate in cross-state learning with 2 cross-state virtual meetings happening during the project period, as well as individualized expert techniques from National Skills Coalition around this question of how do we ensure that essential workers and small businesses in essential industries have better access to upskilling opportunities. And really sharpening that question and thinking through what are executive branch actions that your state can take, whether that's within the governor's office, the labor agency, related agencies, and how might National Skills Coalition help you develop an action plan? Is it a new regulation, new guidance document? Is it an entirely new program that you're trying to stand up? It can be a more modest tweak to an existing program. You know, Robert was describing the iterations that the fund has gone through, or it could be standing up a new program if your state is already contemplating something like the more ambitious brand new effort that Brandy was describing in Michigan. Here's 2 sets of data to help you in this process, to help you identify who's being reached and who maybe needs to be reached by these upskilling opportunities. We will have a contractor available to do virtual focus groups 2 focus groups in each state that's been selected for this project. One focus group will be small businesses, one will be essential workers themselves, and we'll be asking them questions which you'll have the opportunity to weigh in on the questions that are asked of these workers and businesses in your state. And then you'll get a memo after the focus groups that sort of synthesizes the major findings in the qualitative data. And then you'll also get a quantitative data analysis. And Allison's going to talk about that in a minute. But before we get to Allison, I want to just emphasize why we created the project this way. We know that folks have been swimming as hard as they possibly can to keep their heads above water this past 18 months. We know you've been dealing with UI issues. We know you've been dealing with data issues. You've been dealing with your own staff and COVID issues, new initiatives by your governors. Some of you are in the middle of election seasons. It's a lot. We wanted to give you some very practical, concrete, tangible data from workers, from businesses, both qualitative and quantitative, that could help you say, okay, here's where we might want to target some assistance in ways that could help close equity gaps. So that's why the project is designed the way that I've just described. I'm going to turn things over to Allison now. She's going to walk you through the component of the project that CREC is leading. And then we'll come back following that and we'll talk through questions that you all may have and next steps for this project and this process. Okay, so I'm going to turn things over to you, Allison. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can share your screen, and over to you.
Thanks, Amanda. It's great to be here with you today. I am the Vice President for Research at the Center for Regional Economic Competitiveness, and excited to partner with the National Skills Coalition to provide participating states with a data profile that helps to advance policies and programs that accomplish the goals of the Technical Assistance Project. So we've described some of the goals here. These are further described in your materials. You can refer to those for more detail. And just so you know who you're working with here, the Center for Regional Economic Competitiveness, our primary public service goal is to help regions compete. And we do that through support for data-driven decision-making. So what I want to do today with our time that we have is introduce you to our current thinking about the data profile and ask you to start thinking about info you might need and that you might provide and contribute to this data profile for an analysis that gets you closer to a targeted, effective, data-driven talent development project. Encourage everyone to use the chat for feedback for any questions, clarifications that we can address in our Q&A session. So we had the opportunity to speak to a couple of leaders with varying levels of expertise, advancing initiatives for the essential frontline workforce as a major policy priority. And we got a lot of feedback regarding the challenges in defining frontline essential workers and identifying potential impact. So typically, when we started these conversations talking about what is the logic behind these programs and all of the potential outcomes that states might be seeking, inputs being everything that might go into these programs, the outcomes being what you're going to expect, but what you're not going to be able to measure immediately, right? So we use this logic model framework to sort through some of these questions, which are not easy to answer when you have the very ambitious goals that you set for yourselves, serving workers, employed at small businesses, providing value to both firms and to workers. So we're working closely with National Skills Coalition and in consultation with state leaders and have identified potential outcomes and indicators as well as outputs and inputs. And the activity is the policy or program that you choose, and outputs will help you know that your program is on track. And of course, outcomes are driving all of these. In the application materials, you're asked to provide potential outcomes, which will be further developed and finalized through the course of the Technical Assistance Project for participating states, and informed by the research that's provided, including the data profile. So we wanted to explore to make sure we're on track here, that we have the data that's needed, a third-party data, largely publicly available data, some proprietary data that we can bring to the table to help advance your project. So exploring some approaches and just providing some examples here to consider where you're going to land and what kind of information or outcomes you might be thinking about and information that you might be requesting. Some programs, as we've said, will be direct to workers who are seeking additional education and training, and others will be direct to businesses to reach workers at those businesses. So we're thinking about both the participants and the beneficiaries of these programs. Maybe you're going through another intermediary, a workforce board, or an education provider that will work with businesses or direct to workers. So these are the decisions that participating states will make, who are the participants and beneficiaries, and we'll be asking what information is needed to capture the baseline to help you understand where you are starting from and where you might go. And so you can see more detail sort of in the application of what the expectations are at every stage. These are just hypothetical scenarios. We wanted to consider things other than your incumbent worker training programs, but that's also a possibility to extend those. And we're thinking primarily about workers who are employed, as Amanda explains, workers who are employed, especially in entry level, especially exposed to conditions introduced by COVID. So how are you going to define that policy program? So we've included one here. We're thinking about working people without a college degree seeking to gain a credential, another where there's a financial incentive to businesses to partner with a community college, and a third scenario where we're providing an increased transportation subsidy to people working and participating in high quality training. So a number of different outputs, and these are all hypothetical that you might be tracking, and we heard great details from Brandy and Robert in terms of what are those things that they were able to track and find at the end. The outcomes here are just placeholders, but we just wanted to make sure we were considering both those outcomes related to the individual advancement of workers, as well as outcomes that businesses might be seeking. And the baseline information column highlighted in orange here starts to speak to where this information is going to come from, with the information in italics potentially coming from states, potentially coming from third-party sources, whatever works best for you in describing the possibilities here. So for example, in that first row, the number of eligible workers, industries, and occupations, you want to know what that looks like and who those people are, what those industries look like, their dynamics, as well as some baseline information on the programs as they're currently operating, if they are already operating. And then to think about the outcomes as well of the students in similar programs in existing programs. Similarly, if you're targeting business participation, thinking about those essential small businesses, how many, what are the business dynamics in that industry, and how many, if you have that programmatic information, existing programs, how many are served by existing programs, and which are currently partnering with the intermediaries that will be in partnerships that will be incentivized through your programs. And then we also just want to pay attention to those business outcomes, so we can look at business growth patterns at the industry level, as well as outcomes of students in eligible programs, either through the administrative data provided by the state or third-party data that's available on those programs, if they are WIOA programs or post-secondary programs with credit and some insights to non-credit programs. So just to hope that gets you thinking about where you might land and what this might look like as you think about those potential outcomes in your applications, and then think about the technical assistance, the data profile, the partnership that we'll have to develop this and how that will advance your work. And we want to provide some examples of information that we might provide to help fill some of the gaps here, thinking at the industry level, at the individual level. And we're hoping to be fairly creative as we move forward, take advantage of resources that are suggested by states while staying within the bounds of the time and resource limits that we have for this project. So we're going to aim to send these slides out and share these later. So these are fairly detailed in terms of what you might be thinking about, the layout of your data profile, First, you're going to be defining the target populations. Then you're going to be thinking about, well, what are we providing, and how would we know what those destination jobs or opportunities are that we'll be trying to incentivize either staying in place at a firm, growing that business, growing that talent, or opportunities that lead to training and education that leads to better jobs in the same or related industry. And we can define the top target population on a number of factors. So we wanted to lay out who's going to do what a little bit, a lot of detail here, but again, just to set some expectations, the states, the participating states will provide criteria for selecting the target population. We'll be mapping those to occupations and industries, as well as the criteria for identifying destination jobs, whether those are jobs in place in new industries above a certain wage threshold, requiring some digital skills. And then with state provided program data, we are available to do some analysis of those or rely on third-party data depending on what's best for the opportunity. And CRC will help you identify data collection needed as you're working through those data profiles to think about participant and beneficiary level, current participation outcomes, and the potential impact of these programs. So what's your state approach? Advancing the slide. Just thinking about the logic of this, some of the questions, what populations are you seeking to engage, outputs and outcomes that might be expected, and what information will help you advance your goals. And we'll discuss what's needed with the participating states. So just trying to help everyone wrap their head around this description of the target population, baseline information on current program participation and typical outcomes, targeted outputs and outcomes. Those are the main areas we'll be thinking about in providing information and detail on industries, occupations, and populations. Some sample data here pulled for Indiana. This is both public and proprietary, looking at how we define essential workers. A lot of you will find, we found that the essential worker definitions that are out there are very broad, and that we'll be aiming to target these further. But for example, if you took the definition provided by the Labor Market Information Institute, and that's developed based on Department of Homeland Security descriptions of essential workers early during the COVID pandemic, you would find that in Indiana, 31% of workers are essential, and that they're earning $56,000 on average. So you can compare that to the average statewide, and we can see why we'd want to further target these programs to ensure that they meet those that are truly on the front line, that are required to leave their home to go to work, that are disproportionately affected by COVID and the pandemic. And then once you define that population, further identification, focusing on jobs that require no high school diploma, by race, by gender here, so that you can see how that breaks down and further defines the target population, so that we can investigate how many people could be potentially impacted by the intervention. We also want to pay attention to businesses, so make sure you have information about how many workers are essential in key industries, growing industries, as well as how many small businesses are in those industries. And so triangulating some of this information, so we can see if you focused on transportation and warehousing, you'd know that a lot of those workers are essential. If you were working with small businesses in that industry, there's a large number of small businesses. And as you dive deeper into this data, you see a lot of small businesses with under 5 employees. So that kind of size information can help target the policies that you want to advance. And we can cross-tabulate these with the size and industry, employment, wages, productivity, exposure to automation, other items. So here we have wages by industry, and we show that specifically for the population of essential workers. As we've defined it, could be further defined by participating states and further targeted. I think we have some more views to the data here, thinking about the impacted populations, the COVID impacts, the economic impacts. in terms of unemployment and labor force participation and the health impacts of COVID for those workers that were most exposed to the early stages of the pandemic. I'll just check and see if we have any other kind of slides here to help us understand what the impacts were, or how to target your program. So here we're looking at completions by instructional fields. So for specific instructional fields in the state, what are your your completion rates by specific demographic groups? And is that completion representative of the general population? So information you might be familiar with looking at, but we're going to try to bring it together, triangulate it with other information so it helps you advance your targeting of industries, occupations, firms, and workers that might benefit from these programs and the outcomes that you might hope to achieve. One more slide. I forgot we had one more here. So employees and compensation. This is sort of an example, just pushing the information so we can triangulate and think about where are the wage gains, where are workers being paid the lowest on average by firm type, and continue to think about the implications of the targeting of these programs. So that should be it. And I want to turn the floor back to Amanda, and happy to answer any questions later in the period.
Great. Thanks so much, Allison. I know that was a blizzard of information we just presented you all with. What I really hope you take away from this is that the reason that the data profile and the quantitative data piece of this is in the project is to help inform you for whatever policy intervention you might want to be advancing. So if there are questions that you haven't been able to answer, the data profile is really designed to help you with that. A couple things to know. First of all, we're not assuming that each of the 5 states selected for this project would have identical data profiles. We fully assume that there will be some specific things that your state might be looking to answer that might be a little different from another state. Second, the data profile is going to be done early in the project. So it will be done in the November, December, January sort of first 3 months of the project, so that you have that data profile to inform the policy intervention that you're going to develop and test as part of this technical assistance project. So it's front loaded so that you can handle that. It's not meant to duplicate things that your state labor market information agency is already able to do. Our assumption is that your LMI folks are pretty busy and stretched thin. So our hope would be that this data profile is able to fill in a gap of something that you aren't easily able to get with the expertise that you already have within your state. And then finally, just a reminder, you probably saw this in the application materials, that data profiles will be publicly available to other workforce advocates in the state. So we'll work with you as state officials to think through what is, again, the information that's going to be most germane and most useful to inform not only your work within state government, but hopefully the work of advocates outside state government who might also want to be supporting and advocating for the kinds of policies that you're working on moving forward. So that takes us to the end of the formal part of our presentation. We have the rest of the chunk of time here for really 2 purposes. First is to get your questions on the floor. And then second is to begin to answer your questions. We're not going to answer every question today. Some of them will get updated in a additional frequently asked document that will come out next week. But we did want to give you a chance to just get questions on the floor today. And because this is a fairly large group, my colleague Haley is going to split us now into 2 breakout groups. And Allison and I are going to facilitate those groups. And we will take about 10 minutes to just sort of note of your questions and get them on the floor, that is, get a list of them. And then we'll come back together as a large group before we close out. So Haley, can you go ahead and drop folks into the breakout groups? All right, we'll just give other folks a moment to get back from their breakout room, and then we'll briefly go through the next steps for this project. And then we'll close out here.
Our break room is back.
Hey, fantastic. So now that everybody's back, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that I can share the most important thing, which is the deadline information. So first of all, thank you. We surfaced 3 or 4 questions in my breakout room. I'm assuming Allison also surfaced some in hers. I'm going to run through a couple of things right now, just to give quick answers, and then we'll do longer answers in the written FAQ document, which we'll update next week, so that folks can see that. And just to make it easier, get rid of presenter view here so that folks are seeing the full slide. Okay. Okay, so key questions that came up for us. First question was, could this technical assistance project support something that a state is already doing? For example, a state initiative within to have a fellow working specifically on immigrant workforce issues. And the answer is yes, absolutely. We are thrilled to have this TA project be amplifying or supporting an effort that a state already has underway, assuming there's some natural overlap in the Venn diagram. Second question / comment was, could this project help a state official work across state agencies to loop in some of their peers who might be doing related work around upskilling, but are maybe kind of siloed? Yes, absolutely. We strongly encourage that. We've asked you to submit the names of 3 to 5 people on your state team when you apply. We certainly do hope they will be from across multiple agencies within state government. There was a question in particular about some of the really interesting information that Robert shared from Massachusetts, and sort of a comment that peer learning would be a valuable part of this project. I'm glad that seems valuable to folks. We're certainly eager to put you in touch with your peers around the country if you're not already well connected to a particular person or state that you'd like to be engaged with. And then finally, a question I can't answer yet, which is the extent to which this project might be able to reach very small businesses, that is the owner and entrepreneur of a business that might even be a sole proprietor business. We hadn't really contemplated that when we were thinking about essential workers in this program. So let me do some thinking about that. I'll get back to folks. Allison, are there particular questions that came up in your breakout that you'd like to highlight, either to talk about now or just for us to address in the future when we update the FAQ?
We already had some peer learning connections happening, insights from the presentations from today, and people connecting in the session. We had a question about the proposal team and endorsements that were needed in the first application stage. And I noticed that there's some technical assistance around creating partnerships. So what's the most important to have for the application, and what can kind of states continue to work on and develop through the technical assistance?
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. And we'll try to get a little more concrete about that when we do our responses to the FAQ next week. Okay, so I just want to wrap up here by reminding you all of the deadlines that we're operating under. First of all, over the next few weeks, National Skills Coalition staff are available for your questions as you get deeper into this. If you're trying to make the case within state government and get your peers on board with why you should do a TA project in the middle of a pandemic when you're all very busy already, we are here to help. If you have specific questions about the data profile that you would get as a part of this project, or focus groups, or any other component, by all means, reach out. And we're available to hop on the phone with you or go back and forth in email, whatever is most efficient for your time. On October 22nd, so a month from today, your application is due to National Skills Coalition. You're going to email that to me. That information is included in the state application packet that you've already received. And again, We've kept the application short and sweet on purpose so that hopefully it's not particularly burdensome for you to complete. By mid-November, we'll be letting you know whether your state has been selected for this process, and then we'll be kicking off the project. So I want to be respectful of folks' time here. Allison, was there anything else from your perspective that you wanted to make sure to mention before we wrap up here? And then I will double check with my colleague Haley, who is our logistics wizard behind the scenes, to see if there's anything else from Haley's perspective.
Nothing here, just excited to work with you and participating states.
Great. And thanks so much to everybody who took the time to actually join us today. Those of you who've heard me speak before know that I say over and over again, I get up in the morning to do this work, not because I'm interested in policy in some abstract or theoretical sense, but because I care about people, and policy is a lever to make people's lives better. So if you're going to participate in this TA project, I'm hoping it's because you also get up in the morning because you're motivated by how we can use policy to make people's lives better. Haley, anything else logistically at your end before we wrap up here?
Nope, all good here.
Okay, fantastic. So I've got my contact information on the slide here. You all have received previous emails from me, so you should have that handy. Thank you all so much for joining. We'll talk to you again soon.